FBI reporters, Robin and Sam.
And today, we are taking you on a really massive deep dive.
Yeah, we have a really intense mission for this one. We're going to guide you through this giant stack of materials. I mean, we're talking local news reports, historical documents, some deep theological commentaries, and even archaeological surveys.
Which, sounds like a completely random mix at first.
Right, like what do all those have in common? But I promise they are deeply connected. Our goal today is to kind of make sense of a world that honestly feels increasingly chaotic right now.
Yeah, we are going to be looking at the intersections of civic authority, parental responsibility, and what these historical and theological documents describe as unyielding truth.
Yeah.
What happens when that truth meets a society that is just rapidly changing all its rules.
Exactly. So to give you a quick overview of the docket,
we're
starting with local public safety reports from the Philippines. Then we're looking at a really terrifying wave of campus violence in that same area. Then we're crossing over to look at international legal battles over religious freedom in schools in California and Scotland. We've got stories of persecution in West Hollywood and China.
Right, some really heavy stuff in there.
Very heavy. But we're also examining a rare, peaceful pastoral transition at a major church in Los Angeles, and then wrapping it all up with these astonishing archaeological finds that literally unearth ancient biblical history.
It is a lot of ground to cover.
It is. But I want to pose a question to you, the listener, to keep in the back of your mind as we go through all of this. When civil order breaks down, who is ultimately responsible for fixing it?
That is the core question.
Right. Like, is it the government? Is it the school? Or is it something way deeper? So let's jump right into this first framework. We are starting on the streets of Quezon City in the Philippines.
Yeah, in Metro Manila.
Right. And the local government there is cracking down on night markets. I mean, Mayor Joy Belmonte and Police Brigadier General Rodrigo Moranan have issued these really intense directives. What is the actual strategy happening on the ground there?
Well, the Quezon City Police Districts, the QCPD, they're launching what you would basically call a high-saturation public safety campaign. They are specifically targeting these commercial hubs, the night markets, and major transit terminals.
Like the areas around EDSA, right? The big highway.
Exactly. EDSA is this massive circulatory highway for the whole region. So during the evening hours, you get these massive influxes of foot traffic.
Which means lots of money changing hands.
Right. Prime locations for economic activity, but also prime locations for petty theft, illegal street blockades, and unregulated vending.
And the tactics they're using, it's not just, beat cops strolling around. The reports detail them deploying these static police outposts in high-density areas. Why build a fixed structure? I mean, how does a static outpost deter crime better than a roving patrol?
That's a really crucial distinction, actually, because, roving patrols are designed to catch a crime in progress or respond quickly to a call.
Right, like a reaction.
Yes, exactly. But static outposts serve a totally different psychological and logistical function. They establish this permanent, undeniable footprint of state authority.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. When you put a static outpost right in the middle of a night market, you are fundamentally altering the environmental design of that space. I mean, it shortens emergency response times to practically zero within that radius.
Because they're already right there.
Right. But more importantly, it signals to both the vendors and potential criminals that the state is actively claiming jurisdiction over that specific geography.
Got it. And they're pairing that with mobile CCTV units to monitor traffic and stop blockades, so it's this huge surveillance network.
Very comprehensive.
So Mayor Belmonte stated in the reports that the goal is to deter theft, stop illegal vending, and protect legitimate microenterprises. She made a point to say that orderly spaces are absolutely essential for the working class who operate at night.
Which makes total sense from a civic perspective.
Right. But our sources include this fascinating theological commentary that looks at this municipal policy through a totally different lens. How does the biblical framework in these documents interpret, like, Mayor Belmonte's police outposts?
Well, the theological commentaries argue that what we are seeing in Quezon City is actually a perfect modern illustration of the biblical mandate for civil government.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
They draw really heavily on Romans chapter 13, verses 1-4. In that text, the Apostle Paul gives this very clear articulation of why the state even exists. The commentary argues that civil government is ordained by God specifically to wield the sword.
And the sword is a metaphor here, right, for lethal force or coercion.
Yes, exactly. The sword represents the legitimate state-sanctioned authority to use physical force or imprisonment or, financial penalties to maintain public justice, punish wrongdoers, and protect the innocent.
Wow. Okay. So from this perspective, Mayor Belmonte and Brigadier General Moranin, regardless of their personal religious worldview, are actually executing a God-given function.
Right. They're acting as ministers of civil order.
So when the QCPD clears out an illegal blockade or stops a mugging, the argument is that they aren't just enforcing a city ordinance, they're fulfilling a divine mandate for civic justice.
That is precisely the argument in the documents.
Mm-hmm.
And the intended result of that civic justice is outlined in another text they cite, which is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2.
What does that one say?
The goal of this state authority isn't oppression. It's to create a peaceful and orderly environment so that citizens can pursue honest labor, support their families, and live quiet, dignified lives.
Which is exactly what the night market vendors want. I mean, a guy selling skewers at 9 p.m. on EDSA doesn't want a political revolution. He just wants to sell his goods without getting robbed.
Exactly.
But as I was reading through this commentary's application of Romans 13, I thought of an analogy. Tell me if this tracks with the framework our sources are using.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's like civic laws and police forces, like the QCPD, operate like a really sturdy iron fence built around a pasture.
A fence around a pasture. Okay, how does that work mechanically?
Well, the fence is absolutely necessary to keep the wolves out, right? You need the police outposts, you need the CCTV cameras, the physical presence of the state to create that perimeter of safety.
Right, because if you take the fence down,
The wolves rush in and the pasture is destroyed. But here is the critical limitation of a fence. It cannot change the nature of the sheep inside. It only manages behavior externally through physical obstruction.
oh, wow. Yeah, that analogy aligns perfectly with the theological commentary provided here.
Yeah.
The vendors in Quezon City are rightly celebrating the external security, the reinforcement of the fence.
Because it works for the immediate threat.
Right. But the documents argue that external forces, no matter how robust they are, cannot govern the internal human heart.
Because if someone possesses deep-seated malice or desperate greed, they will eventually find a way over, under, or through that fence. I mean, a CCTV camera can record a crime, but it can't make a criminal love their neighbor.
That is the exact limitation the commentaries are highlighting. When a society loses its internal moral compass, what the theological sources call the fear of God lawlessness will inevitably bypass the external restraints.
Fence fails.
Yeah. A police officer can tackle a thief, but the state has no tool, no mechanism to remove the greed that caused the thief to steal in the first place.
Right.
This is why the sources draw such a sharp line between the role of the state and the role of the church. The state's job is to restrain evil externally with the sword. But the church's job, according to this framework, is a proclamation of truth that transforms human hearts internally.
And understanding that precise tension between the external fence of the state and the internal condition of the human heart, that is so critical for understanding the next situation in our sources. Because we are about to look at what happens when internal restraints completely collapse.
And the external fence proves utterly insufficient.
Exactly. We are moving from the night markets to the educational system in the Philippines. And the data we have here is, it's deeply sobering.
It is genuinely shocking. We are looking at a Senate committee report detailing a wave of school violence in the Philippines that is statistically unprecedented for that region.
Yeah, between June 16 and July 6, which is a window of just 3 weeks, there were 15 distinct major incidents of school violence.
Just 3 weeks.
Yeah, we're talking stabbings, fatal shootings, firearm confiscations inside classrooms, and sweeping online bomb threats. The toll from just those 3 weeks was 3 students dead and 32 injured.
To understand the gravity of this, you really have to look at the cultural context. The Philippines has not historically grappled with mass campus violence or school shootings in the way that, say, the United States has.
Right, it's a totally new phenomenon there.
So for 15 incidents to occur in 3 weeks represents a massive, sudden sociological shift.
And the specifics of these cases are just harrowing. Let's look at the June 22 incident in Tacloban City. 2 students, aged 14 and 15, opened fire inside the San Jose National High School. They killed 3 of their peers and injured at least 20 others. The medical reports noted that 15 of those injuries were direct gunshot wounds. How do 2 young teenagers even execute something on that scale?
It requires a level of premeditation and access to weaponry that really shocked the local authorities. And unfortunately, it wasn't an isolated anomaly.
Right, there's another one.
Yeah, 2 months later, on August 18th, at the Ateneo de Zamboanga University, or ADZAU, at their junior high school campus, A 14-year-old grade 9 student managed to bypass security, bring two 9mm handguns into room 404, and he shot and killed a grade 10 student and then turned the weapon on himself.
And the detail that really highlights the modern digital nature of this crisis. He live-streamed parts of the attack on social media using a body-worn camera.
Which is just chilling.
It's a level of performative violence that feels entirely imported from the darker corners of the internet. And the list in the report goes on. There was an attack at Bethel Academy in General Trias where a grade 8 student attacked peers with a kitchen knife. There were stabbings in Negros, Occidental, Cavite, Zamboanga, and Davao City. Plus, this massive wave of digital bomb threats that forced schools to just shut down entirely and go to remote learning.
Right. And when you analyze the initial response from the government authorities, you see them instinctively trying to rebuild that fence we discussed.
Literally.
The Department of the Interior and local government, the DILG, and the Philippine National Police, the PNP, they immediately conducted on-site security assessments.
But the assessments revealed a terrifying reality. DILG Secretary Yanvic Ramula specifically noted that in the Zamboanga shooting, the school actually followed the law. They had security protocols. They checked bags.
The physical perimeter was intact.
Right. The shooter simply found a loophole. He found a vulnerability in the fence. So because the physical fence failed, the government's focus shifted heavily toward a different kind of external pressure, which is severe legal accountability.
Yes, specifically targeting the accountability of the gun owners who allowed these minors to access the weapons in the first place.
Right. DOJ Secretary Frederick Vita announced they found probable cause to file criminal...
Well, our sources address this by looking at the theological foundations of justice. The commentary argues that holding these custodians accountable is absolutely the correct and necessary move.
Okay, why?
The underlying logic here relies on the biblical doctrine of the Imago Dei. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 states that humans are made in the image of God. Therefore, human life possesses immense, inherent, and sacred worth.
So how does that connect to the negligence charge for the aunt?
Because a firearm is a highly lethal tool designed to end life. If you own one, you have a strict civic and moral duty to secure it. Failing to secure a lethal weapon, which then results in the slaughter of individuals made in God's image, is considered a severe negligence of the duty to protect life.
The state is essentially saying your negligence facilitated murder and justice demands a reckoning.
Correct. And this ties right back to Romans chapter 13, verse 4. The civil government is tasked with punishing evil. Enforcing severe accountability upon negligent custodians is a proper, legitimate exercise of judicial justice. It serves as a deterrent.
Right.
But the theological sources are quick to point out the limitation. This is, once again, just reinforcing the fence. Putting the ant in prison for negligence does not address the internal malice of the 14-year-old who pulled the trigger.
And this is exactly where the debate in the sources explodes. Because everyone from the Senate to the school boards is asking, how do we fix the internal motivation? How do we stop the wolf? And the secular psychological community steps in with a very specific framework, which immediately clashes with the Department of Education.
It was a massive clash.
Yeah, let's break down this conflict.
So the DABIT originally recognized the severity of the threat and ordered public schools nationwide to execute a highly realistic, simultaneous active shooter drill on August 25. The goal was practical preparedness, muscle memory in a crisis.
Make sure the kids know what to do if it happens.
Right. But the psychiatric establishment pushed back with incredible force. The Philippine Psychiatric Association, the PPA, along with the PSCAP and the PPS, issued these joint public statements urging the government to completely defer the drills.
What is the actual mechanical argument these psychiatrists are making? I mean, why oppose a safety drill?
Their argument is rooted in secular trauma theory. They claim that these hyper-realistic simulations lack empirical backing for their effectiveness, and more importantly, that they cause severe clinical trauma and acute anxiety in children.
So the drill itself is the danger.
According to them, yes.
Yeah.
They argue that exposing a developing nervous system to loud alarms, simulated gunfire, and high-stress tactical scenarios is psychologically damaging and counterproductive.
So as a result of that pressure, Secretary Sonny Angara backed down. He deferred the nationwide drills and pivoted instead toward non-simulated preparedness. Things like tabletop exercises for administrators and physical security infrastructure, metal detectors, reinforced doors, transparent backpacks.
Which is a complete paradigm shift from active preparation to passive avoidance.
And our theological sources offer a very strong critique of this psychiatric response. Let me see if I can distill their argument from the notes. The biblical counseling perspective represented here seems to view the secular psychiatric framework as fundamentally diagnosing the wrong disease.
How so?
Well, the psychiatrists are treating the child's anxiety during a drill as a clinical pathology that must be eradicated. They are saying, don't do the drill, the anxiety itself is the harm. But the theological critique argues that treating anxiety as the primary issue when 14-year-olds are bringing Glocks into a classroom is a catastrophic misdiagnosis.
That is a highly accurate summary of the biblical counseling position. The fundamental divergence is in how the two worldviews define the human condition.
Yeah.
What secular psychologists categorize as clinical trauma or pathological anxiety in this specific context, the fear of a shooter drill, is what the biblical framework simply identifies as a natural, rational fear of a genuinely dangerous environment.
But the secular model wants to cure the fear.
Yes, by removing the trigger, which in this case is the drill. But the biblical counselors argue that when a society abandons moral absolutes, the environment becomes objectively, inherently dangerous. Experiencing fear in a dangerous world is not a clinical malfunction. It's a rational response to the realities of human depravity.
The theological sources heavily cite Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, which states that the human heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. How does that text change the approach to the shooters themselves?
It changes the entire starting premise of the investigation. Secular sociology and psychology look at a 14-year-old shooter and ask, what external systemic trauma or societal failure caused this boy to become a monster? They look for an environmental trigger like poverty, bullying, or a lack of mental health funding.
They assume the child is inherently good until the environment corrupts them.
Exactly. But the biblical worldview posits the exact opposite. It understands that the capacity for profound malice, murder, and cruelty is already inherent in the unbroken, unregenerate human heart.
So the environment doesn't create it.
No, the environment doesn't create the evil. The environment merely restrains it or allows it to flourish. You cannot cure radical inherent depravity by banning online lone wolf grooming forums or forcing kids to use clear backpacks. Those are just structural guardrails.
We are right back to the fence. The state is just trying to build a higher fence.
Because that is literally all the state has the tools to do. But the biblical commentary asserts that true security and true societal restoration cannot be engineered through avoidance strategies or metal detectors. Lasting renewal requires a fundamental change of the human heart, which begins with a return to the fear of the Lord, as cited in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7.
And the sources point out that this internal moral formation is not the responsibility of the government. They highlight a massive failure on the part of the family unit.
Yes. The cultural commentary in the reports notes that traditional respect for school authority is eroding rapidly, and that overzealous parenting that attacks institutional discipline has weakened the basic social guardrails. But the theological documents take it further, pointing to the divine mandate for moral instruction.
Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4.
Correct. That text explicitly commands fathers to bring their children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The argument made here is that the moral formation of children is a jurisdiction given exclusively to the parents, not the state.
So when families drop the ball.
Exactly. When families abdicate that responsibility and outsource the spiritual and moral instruction of their children to secular institutions or abandon them to the digital Wild West of social media, the results are catastrophic.
It's fascinating how the secular government officials actually echo this without even realizing the theological weight of what they're saying. The report quotes DepEd Undersecretary Malcolm Garma discussing the psychological factors and the radicalization in online gaming spaces.
What did he say?
Garma literally admitted to the press, he said, even if we secure our schools in terms of the facilities, if there's the intention, influence, and the motivation, they will really do it.
Wow. He is unwittingly stating the exact premise of Jeremiah 17.9. If the internal heart desires to commit evil, it will eventually bypass the external facility security.
Yeah.
You cannot legislate or medicate a wicked heart into righteousness.
So we've established that the state cannot fix the internal human heart. It can only manage behavior with the sword. But what happens when the state forgets its limits? What happens when government institutions decide they don't just want to build the fence, but they actually want to mandate spiritual or ideological instruction inside the pasture?
That transition leads us directly into a deeply concerning international legal conflict outlined in our sources. We are seeing secular, state-run institutions increasingly encroaching on parental rights and religious liberties, often under the guise of civic education or social justice.
Which takes us out of the Philippines and over to Northern California, specifically the Palo Alto Unified School District. The documents detail a federal lawsuit filed on August 7 by a coalition of parents against the district. The focal point of this lawsuit is a high school program called the Social Justice Pathway. What are the actual mechanics of this program? Like, how was it supposed to function?
So, the Social Justice Pathway, or SJP, is designed as a 3-year specialized curriculum for 10th through 12th grade students. Ostensibly, the district frames it as an interdisciplinary approach to teaching standard history and literature, but filtered specifically through a modern social justice and activism framework.
Right, but the federal lawsuit alleges that the implementation of this curriculum crossed a massive, unconstitutional line regarding the separation of church and state. The court documents detail a series of field trips taken to the Muslim Community Association of the Bay Area. Now, a field trip to a religious site isn't inherently illegal, but the plaintiffs allege that this went far beyond a museum tour. What exactly happened on these trips?
The lawsuit outlines several specific, highly problematic activities. It alleges that female public school students were handed hijabs and actively encouraged by the hosts to wear them during the visit.
Wait, they were told to put them on?
Yes. Furthermore, the students were placed in positions to observe midday Islamic prayers. They were engaged in a Quran memorization course, and they were given physical copies of the Quran to take home.
The district also allegedly granted an activist named Zahra Billoo unfettered access to the students. And the core legal claim of the lawsuit is that the SJP curriculum actively elevated Islam over all other world religions by uniquely portraying it as the true faith of social justice while ignoring or marginalizing others.
Which, if proven in court, would be a direct violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which prohibits the government from making any law respecting an establishment of religion or unduly favoring one religion over another.
And here's the detail that really complicates the narrative for the school district. The coalition of parents filing this lawsuit. They aren't conservative Christians pushing back against secularism. The plaintiffs include Jewish, Hindu, and Zoroastrian parents.
That's a very broad coalition.
Yeah. And the cultural climate in Palo Alto is so tense regarding this issue that some of the Jewish parents actually filed under anonymous pseudonyms because they genuinely feared that public exposure would lead to personal harm or professional retaliation.
That detail speaks volumes about the coercive social environment surrounding this curriculum.
But the district and its defenders obviously have a different perspective. Activist Zahra Billoo responded to the lawsuit by arguing that educational neutrality doesn't mean shielding students from learning about religion. Her argument is that visiting a mosque and observing a prayer isn't the same thing as being compelled by the state to practice the faith.
Which is a common defense for these programs.
Right. There was even a student who defended the trip on social media, claiming they never felt anyone was trying to forcefully convert them. They were just getting hands-on experience with an underrepresented culture. So I want to explore the mechanics of this defense. Let's say we live in a deeply globalized, interconnected society. Isn't a field trip just cultural education? I mean, how do the courts, and more importantly, how do the theological sources we have differentiate between civic education and spiritual coercion?
It is a vital legal and theological distinction. The legal arguments in the lawsuit and the theological commentary applied to this case draw a hard, impenetrable line between learning about a religion in an objective, historical, or sociological context and being pressured into participating in its devotional practices.
What is the specific mechanism of participation that crosses the line here?
It comes down to the inherent coercive power of the state. Public school teachers and administrators represent the authority of the government. When those authority figures place minors in an environment where they are handed religious garments like a hijab, or placed in a room to simulate or observe active localized worship, the power dynamic makes it inherently coercive.
Because it's coming from an authority figure.
Exactly. The student is no longer objectively studying a text. They are being socially pressured by state actors to conform to a religious practice.
And the theological sources view this through the lens of the First Commandment.
Yes. Exodus chapter 20, verse 3 states unequivocally, "You shall have no other gods before me." For the believer, the commentary notes that even the appearance of participating in the devotion or worship of a false deity is strictly forbidden. The conscience must be protected from idolatry.
And this connects directly back to what we just discussed regarding the Philippines and the mandate for moral instruction.
Yes, the biblical framework insists that God gave the mandate of spiritual and moral formation entirely to the family, not to the civil government. The sources reference Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 to 7, which commands parents to teach God's words diligently to their children in their homes and as they walk by the way.
So the state is overstepping.
Hugely. When a state institution attempts to coerce the conscience of a minor, even if they label it social justice, cultural immersion, or multi-faith tolerance, the theological argument is that the state is actively usurping God's divine design for the family.
It is a profound overreach of their Romans 13 boundaries. I mean, the state is authorized to hold a sword to stop a mugger in Quezon City. It is not authorized to hand out religious texts or enforce spiritual conformity in California.
Precisely. The documents note that believers are called to test all things, as 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21 says, and to live peacefully with all men, according to Romans chapter 12, verse 18. But peaceful civic coexistence does not require surrendering a child's spiritual conscience to the secular state.
And this pressure to conform, this blurring of the lines between civic participation and religious compliance, isn't just an isolated legal anomaly in California. We see this exact dynamic playing out globally. Let's look at the viral incident documented in our sources from Stirling, Scotland.
The Beaver Scout video. This is a very compelling visual representation of the conflict.
It really is. For context, Beaver Scouts are the youngest tier of the scouting movement in the UK, typically aged 6 to 8 years old. The video in question shows a local Stirling group visiting the Central Scotland Islamic Centre. The stated purpose was to earn a faith activity badge.
Right.
In the video, a representative from the mosque is standing at the front, demonstrating the physical sequence of Islamic prayer. And the scout leaders, along with the young children, are all encouraged to join in the physical positions, literally bowing down, kneeling, and prostrating themselves on the floor facing Mecca.
Except for one specific child.
Right. While the entire group of adults and children bow down in unison, the camera captures one 6-year-old boy who refuses. He remains standing completely upright, his hands by his sides, just watching the room. He actively refused to participate in the physical motion of the prayer.
Wow.
The video was subsequently shared online by British activist Tommy Robinson, and it exploded across social media, racking up millions of views.
And we really have to view this video within its broader sociological context. This footage went viral right against the backdrop of the massive Unite the Kingdom rallies in London, where tens of thousands of citizens are actively protesting government policies regarding national identity, immigration, and what they view as forced religious integration.
The tension in the UK is palpable right now, but let's focus on that specific image of the 6-year-old boy standing while everyone else bows. The defenders of these interfaith scouting badges argue that participating in the motions fosters mutual respect and demystifies the other. But the theological analysis in our notes asks a much deeper question. What does genuine civic respect actually require?
The commentary argues that genuine civic respect in a pluralistic society does not and cannot require religious compliance.
You can respect your neighbor's right to worship without praying to their God.
Exactly. Forcing impressionable children, who possess a natural inclination to obey authority figures like scout leaders, to perform acts of religious worship violates basic principles of liberty and conscience. But more importantly, from the theological perspective applied here, it violates the child's exclusive allegiance to the true God.
The act of bowing is never morally neutral in Scripture.
Never. The commentary points out that physical posture in worship is deeply significant in the biblical text. That young boy in Scotland visually demonstrated the exact posture required by the theological framework, guarding the conscience against idolatry. The sources argue that parents must teach their children that true conviction requires standing firm in the exclusivity of truth, even when the surrounding culture, the school board, or the scout leader demands that everyone bow down in the name of tolerance.
But the reality presented in our next set of sources is that if you do refuse to bow down, if you do stand upright and proclaim an exclusive truth, the surrounding culture isn't just going to politely disagree with you and move on. The pressure to conform often escalates far beyond federal lawsuits and viral Twitter videos. It inevitably escalates into severe physical persecution.
The theological framework driving our sources posits that the world system is fundamentally, structurally hostile to the exclusivity of the gospel. It is not a matter of if conflict will occur, but when. That is a reality the church is commanded to always be prepared to face.
Let's talk about the brutal cost of that public witness. We have two stories here that are geographically separated by thousands of miles and politically separated by vastly different systems of government, but they share the exact same underlying mechanism of hostility. First, let's look at a grassroots example from West Hollywood, California, specifically an area known as the Rainbow District.
The incident occurred early on a Saturday morning, August 15, at approximately 2 a.m.
The streets were crowded. David Ramirez, a street evangelist affiliated with a ministry called Kingdom Enterprises, was out preaching to the late-night crowd. Now, street preaching can take many forms, some of them highly antagonistic, but the eyewitness accounts in our sources, specifically from a man named David Hoffman, paint a very specific picture of Ramirez's demeanor.
What did he say?
According to Hoffman, just moments before the assault, Ramirez had actually embraced a member of the LGBT community in the crowd. He told the crowd directly and plainly that he loved them, but that he did not want them to go to hell.
He was pairing an exclusive, inherently offensive truth claim regarding divine judgment with a genuine, physical demonstration of human compassion.
And a crowd's response to that compassion was sudden, brutal, and entirely unprovoked violence. While Ramirez was speaking, an unidentified assailant walked up behind him, bypassed his peripheral vision, and sucker punched him directly in the throat.
Oh my goodness.
The assailant then struck him 2 more times directly in the airway as he was reeling, before just casually walking away into the crowd. And the most chilling detail: the crowd of bystanders didn't gasp or call for help. They cheered. They shouted and cursed at the injured preacher while he struggled to breathe.
The medical fallout detailed in the reports is severe. The blunt force trauma from the assault cracked the cartilage in Ramirez's thyroid and caused massive acute swelling in his vocal cords. He lost his voice entirely on the spot and had to be placed on high-dose medical steroids just to avoid emergency reconstructive surgery on his airway.
But the detail that the theological commentaries focus on is Ramirez's immediate reaction. Before he even fully lost his voice, mere seconds after taking the blows to the throat and realizing the crowd was cheering for his attacker, Ramirez was recorded raising his hands, praising God, and thanking Jesus for the opportunity to suffer. He wasn't screaming for police retaliation or cursing the crowd. He was rejoicing. How does the theological framework explain that kind of unnatural response to trauma?
The commentaries argue that Ramirez's response is an astonishing modern parallel to the witness of the early Christian church. They specifically cite Acts chapter 5, verse 41. In that historical account, after the apostles were physically beaten and flogged by the religious leaders for preaching, the text says they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name.
They viewed the physical suffering not as a failure of their mission, but as a validation of it.
Precisely, because they understood the theological mechanics of the culture they were engaging. The Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, that the message of the cross is absolute foolishness to those who are perishing. When an evangelist tells a secular, sexually liberated culture that they are in imminent danger of divine judgment and eternal hell, they are not inviting a polite philosophical debate. They are frequently inviting visceral worldly offense.
And the sources point out a stark failure of the state in this moment. The civil government, which Romans 13 tasks with protecting the innocent from assault, completely failed Ramirez. The reports note that the local police were uncooperative and slow to respond. The fence failed to protect him.
It did.
But the theological takeaway is that while the state failed to protect his physical body, the truth of the message was not ultimately silenced by the violence, because his joy in suffering became a secondary, even more powerful witness.
That's a profound way to look at it.
Now, I want to compare that chaotic, grassroots, street-level violence in California to the cold, institutional violence happening in China. Because while the mechanism of the assault is different, the underlying hostility is identical. We have a critical update in the sources regarding the international campaign to reunite Pastor John Cow with his family. What are the facts of this case?
The situation with Pastor Cow is a deeply heartbreaking example of state-sponsored persecution. He is a 67-year-old Christian missionary and a permanent U.S. resident. For decades, his primary ministry focus was building schools, 16 in total, along the impoverished border region of Myanmar, serving children who had absolutely no access to education.
He was doing objectively good humanitarian work.
Yes. But in 2017, the Chinese Communist Party arrested him. They sentenced him to 7 years in a Chinese prison on what international watchdogs universally agree were entirely fabricated charges of organizing illegal border crossings. Now, Pastor Cow served that entire grueling 7-year sentence. He officially finished his prison term in March of 2024.
Okay, so he should be free.
But during his imprisonment, his health collapsed. He was diagnosed with late-stage prostate cancer.
Oh, wow.
And this is where the mechanism of state oppression becomes deeply bureaucratic and sinister. Now that his formal legal sentence is over, the CCP cannot legally hold him in a jail cell. So instead, they are utilizing administrative maneuvers to keep him trapped inside the country. They are systematically and arbitrarily denying him the passport clearances and exit visas he requires to leave China and return to his wife and children in the United States.
It is an administrative exit ban. It's a way of continuing the punishment without the optics of a prison cell. Organizations like China Aid and International Christian Concern are desperately trying to get the U.S. State Department and foreign governments to intervene because given his late-stage cancer diagnosis, this exit ban is quite literally a slow-motion death sentence. How common is this tactic?
Unfortunately, it is a highly common and effective mechanism of control. The CTP frequently uses these bureaucratic loopholes, travel bans, frozen bank accounts, revoked licenses, to continue punishing religious dissidents long after their formal sentences end, or to paralyze them without ever bringing formal charges.
It's all just red tape.
Yeah, our sources note court records from Anhui province illustrating this broader crackdown. House church leaders from the Meizhong Reformed Church, specifically Zhang Sensen, Chengxin, and Ma Shutao, were recently sentenced to prison under the guise of organizing illegal gatherings.
The state weaponizes fraud charges, zoning laws, and travel restrictions to crush the independence of Protestant congregations because they refuse to submit to the state-sanctioned three-self patriotic movement. So, looking at the theological framework, how do we connect a sudden sucker punch from a random citizen in West Hollywood to a calculated bureaucratic exit ban orchestrated by the intelligence apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party?
The connection lies in recognizing the root cause of the hostility. The theological commentary argues that whether the violence is enacted by an angry late-night crowd in California or the sophisticated legal bureaucracy of the CCP, it stems from the exact same spiritual reality. An organized, fundamental rebellion against the ultimate authority of Christ. When the Chinese state invents charges against house church pastors and imposes arbitrary exit bans on dying missionaries, they are radically exceeding the boundaries God ordained for civil government.
Instead of wielding the sword to punish evil, they are weaponizing the law to punish righteousness. They're acting as a terror to good conduct.
Exactly. And furthermore, regarding Pastor Cao's specific situation, the commentary argues that the state is directly violating natural law. Scripture places a profound, non-negotiable moral priority on familial obligations.
Which verse is that?
The sources cite 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, which speaks to the severe duty of a man to provide for his own household. By deliberately utilizing red tape to withhold a gravely ill husband and father from his family, the Chinese government is not just violating international law, they are violating fundamental human dignity and the natural law designed by God.
So when the state turns into the wolf, what is the recourse for the global church? I mean, they can't exactly vote the CCP out of power.
The documents outline two primary responses for the believer: intercessory prayer and an unyielding commitment to truth. The commentary cites Psalm chapter 82, verses 1-4, which commands God's people to vindicate the weak and the fatherless and to rescue the afflicted. They also point to Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3, which instructs the church to remember those who were in prison as though they were in prison with them.
Just praying for them.
Yeah, the theological response is to hold these earthly rulers accountable in prayer, resting in the conviction that God is the ultimate sovereign judge over every earthly magistrate.
It is a heavy, sobering reality. Whether you are a student in a high school classroom facing physical danger, a street preacher on a public corner facing assault, or a missionary in a foreign nation facing the full weight of a hostile government, the pressure to compromise the truth or suffer the consequences is immense.
It's everywhere.
But amidst all of this systemic hostility, the sources also show us that the local church is not meant to be a place of chaos. It is meant to be a bastion of order and truth. Let's look at some deeply encouraging news regarding how a church actually functions when it is healthy.
Yes, we are looking at a remarkably peaceful and faithful transition of leadership.
Out of Los Angeles, California, we have the official announcement from Grace Community Church. The elder board of that massive congregation has unanimously affirmed Dr. Nathan Busenitz as the new senior pastor.
This is a highly significant transition in the landscape of American evangelicalism. He is succeeding the late John MacArthur, who shepherded that specific congregation for an astonishing 56 years.
56 years at a single church. In an era where the average pastoral tenure is statistically hovering around, 4 to 5 years?
Yeah, right around there.
That kind of longevity is almost unheard of. The transition announcement coincided with the one-year anniversary of MacArthur's memorial service. And what really stands out in the internal reports provided in our sources is the methodology of the transition, how deliberate and careful the elders were. They didn't rush the process. Busenitz was serving as the interim staff pastor, but his roots in the congregation go incredibly deep.
The biographical data notes that he was raised within that very congregation. He didn't just arrive with a flashy resume. He served as a lay Bible study shepherd. He co-pastored a local fellowship group. He worked intimately as MacArthur's personal assistant. And he served academically as the executive vice president and a professor of church history at the Master's Seminary.
What strikes me most about this report is the massive contrast between how the secular world measures a successful organizational transition and how this specific church approached it based on their theological framework. If a massive secular corporation like a Fortune 500 company loses a CEO who built the brand over 56 years, the ensuing panic is measurable.
Oh, absolutely.
They hire expensive external headhunters, they look for a charismatic outsider to shake things up, they launch a rebranding campaign, and they obsess over quarterly metrics and PR optics.
But the biblical metrics for ministerial success, as defined by the documents governing this church, are entirely different, almost antithetical to the corporate model, really. The elders' decision explicitly noted that their primary reason for affirming Busenitz was entrusting him to preserve the church's unwavering commitment to expository preaching.
Define expository preaching for us in this context.
Expository preaching is the systematic, verse-by-verse explanation and application of the biblical text, drawing out the original author's intended meaning, rather than imposing the preacher's own ideas or cultural trends onto the passage. The elders were not looking for innovation, cultural relevance, or a corporate rebranding. They were looking for structural, theological faithfulness to the text.
And the governmental structure of how this happened is equally vital to point out. It wasn't a hostile corporate takeover. It wasn't decided by a popular Democratic vote of the congregation that split the church in half. It was a unanimous affirmation by the existing board of elders. Why does that structural detail matter so much to the theological framework?
It highlights a crucial foundational principle regarding biblical church government. According to the pastoral epistles, the local church is not designed to be run by a single unchecked CEO, nor is it meant to be a pure democracy driven by popular opinion. It is designed to be governed by a plurality of qualified elders.
A group of leaders.
Exactly. The commentaries point to 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, which outlines the mandate for these men. They are to shepherd the flock of God with profound humility, exercising oversight willingly, not domineering over those in their charge, but proving to be examples to the flock.
And their primary tool for that oversight isn't corporate management, it's holding fast to the truth. The sources cite 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2. Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching.
Exactly. The theological critique embedded in our notes observes that modern evangelical culture frequently falls into the trap of elevating charismatic celebrity personalities or chasing impressive numerical growth metrics, completely mirroring the secular corporate world. But the biblical warning found in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 to 13, is that the ultimate quality of our work will be tested by fire.
Right.
True success for a local church is measured solely by the faithful proclamation of the gospel, the genuine discipleship of believers, and the unyielding recognition that Christ alone, not any pastor or board, is the true head of the church. This principle of Christ's supremacy is foundational, as the Apostle Paul writes in Colossians chapter 1, verse 28, and throughout Ephesians chapter 4.
That deep, structural commitment to biblical authority, the conviction that the church must submit exclusively to Christ rather than bending to cultural demands, state pressures, or corporate pragmatism, is not a new phenomenon. In fact, our historical sources provide a stunning window into exactly what it looks like when pastors are forced, under the threat of ruin, to choose between the demands of the secular state and the truth of the scriptures. Let's take a journey deep into the historical record.
We are looking at a comprehensive historical analysis provided by the Christian History Institute regarding an event known as the Great Ejection of 1662.
To understand the gravity of this, we have to meticulously set the scene. We are in London, England, the year 1662. The monarchy has recently been restored. King Charles II has returned to the throne after the turbulent years of the English Civil War and the Puritan Protectorate. The National Parliament, deeply loyal to the newly restored crown and anxious to crush any lingering dissent, passes a sweeping draconian law called the Act of Uniformity. What exactly did this law demand of the clergy?
The Act of Uniformity was a rigid, legally uncompromising statute designed to enforce absolute religious homogeneity across the nation. It mandated that every single minister, vicar, curate, and even schoolmaster in England must give their full, unfeigned, and public assent to the newly revised Book of Common Prayer.
So they were legally required to read from a state-approved script.
Yes, but it went further than just reading a book. They had to submit to episcopal ordination by a state bishop, even if they were already ordained, and they had to formally renounce any previous theological covenants or oaths they had taken that contradicted the state church. And the deadline for total compliance was set for St. Bartholomew's Day, which fell on August 24th, 1662.
And what were the mechanics of the penalty? If a Puritan or Presbyterian pastor looked at the Book of Common Prayer, realized it contained doctrines or prescribed rituals that violated his understanding of Scripture, and refused to publicly assent by August 24th, what happened to him?
The penalty was absolute and immediate forfeiture. They faced the immediate loss of their church livings, meaning they were physically locked out of their pulpits, they lost their parsonages, meaning their families were evicted from their homes, and they lost all financial stipends and support. Refusing to comply meant being entirely stripped of their livelihood and reduced to immediate poverty by decree of the state.
The civil magistrate was essentially holding a financial and legal gun to the head of the church, saying, "You will worship exactly how the king tells you to worship. You will wear the specific priestly vestments the parliament dictates. You will kneel at the exact altars we design, or you will be utterly ruined." It is the ultimate historical example of the state attempting to dictate the internal worship and doctrine of the church, completely violating the boundaries of Romans 13.
The historical accounts of how these men responded are profoundly moving. The sources contain excerpts from the famous diary of Samuel Pepys, who documented the tense days leading up to the St. Bartholomew's Day deadline. Pepys walked through the streets of London and recorded seeing these massive, overflowing sanctuaries.
He describes congregants standing jammed at the doors, hanging out of open windows, openly weeping in the streets as they listen to the final farewell sermons of their beloved pastors.
On Sunday, August 17, 1662, which was the final Lord's Day before the legal deadline fell, over 900 Puritan, Presbyterian, Independent, and Congregationalist ministers preached their farewell sermons to their heartbroken flocks. When the dust settled across the nation, roughly 2,000 ministers were officially ejected from the Church of England.
2,000 pastors willingly choosing financial ruin, social exile, and profound poverty for their families, simply because they refused to compromise their biblical convictions. It is an astounding historical witness. The government actually had military troops on high alert and stationed on standby because Parliament was terrified that ejecting 2,000 beloved pastors would trigger a violent civil uprising. But the riots never happened. Why?
Because of the theological convictions of the ejected ministers. They did not riot or call for armed rebellion. They led their flocks with peaceful, solemn dignity. They submitted to the unjust loss of their physical property and their positions, but they absolutely refused to yield the jurisdiction of their conscience to the king.
The theological analysis notes that these men perfectly modeled the apostolic defiance recorded in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, where Peter declares, "We must obey God rather than men."
They possessed a highly nuanced theology of the state. They understood that while Romans 13 commands believers to respect and submit to civil magistrates in temporal, earthly matters, taxes, civil order, criminal law, the state completely and illegitimately crosses its God-ordained boundary when it attempts to enforce religious conformity or dictate theology.
Because Christ alone, not King Charles II and not the English Parliament, is the supreme head of the church. The sources point to Colossians chapter 1, verse 18 to anchor this truth.
Yes, yielding that divine prerogative, allowing an earthly king to determine the doctrines of the church, was considered treason against Christ, and it was unthinkable to these men, even at the cost of their livelihoods.
But the narrative gets even more intense, and it proves the enduring nature of their character. The state wasn't satisfied with just firing them. 3 years later, in 1665, Parliament passed a vicious piece of legislation called the 5 Mile Act. Explain the mechanics of this law.
The 5 Mile Act made it a criminal offense for any of these ejected non-conformist pastors to even live or travel within 5 miles of any incorporated town or any parish where they had previously served as a minister.
That's incredibly vindictive.
It was. It was designed to physically isolate them from their former congregations, cut off any secret financial support they might be receiving, and drive them into the rural wilderness. The state was actively hunting and oppressing these men.
But then Providence strikes. The Great Plague of London, the bubonic plague, hits the city with terrifying force.
This occurred between 1664 and 1666. It was a microbiological catastrophe.
The historical records note weekly death tolls exceeding 6,000 people in London alone. Dead bodies were literally piling up in the streets. And what happened to the religious leadership of the city during this crisis? The establishment, state-approved ministers, the men who had compromised their theology, signed the Act of Uniformity, and kept their comfortable salaries and beautiful parsonages. What did they do when the plague hit?
The overwhelming majority of them fled the city. They evacuated to the countryside to save themselves, completely abandoning their terrified, dying flocks in the process.
But the non-conformist pastors, the ejected Puritans who had been treated like criminals and banned from the city by the 5 Mile Act, men like Thomas Vincent. When the state clergy fled, these exiled men voluntarily turned around and ran into the plague-stricken city.
They knowingly risked and often lost their own lives to preach the gospel to the panicked masses and physically care for the dying in the squalor of the city.
It is an absolutely chilling testament to their character. They had literally nothing earthly to gain. They had no state favor, no legal protection, no salary, no prestige. They were criminals in the eyes of the law.
The historical analysis concludes that their actions prove their ministry was not born of state patronage or a desire for comfortable employment. It was born of a genuine sacrificial love for God and a profound love for their neighbor. The commentaries cite Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 to 10, which instructs believers not to grow weary in doing good. Thomas Vincent and his fellow dissenters demonstrated that true, enduring servant leadership is anchored in eternal truth, completely independent of the shifting winds of political favor.
And speaking of how history continually validates and anchors the truth of the biblical record, let's look at the physical evidence of the ancient world. We are moving from 17th century London to 1st century Asia Minor. We have a fascinating, detailed report from the Biblical Archaeology Society focusing on the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul.
Specifically, this report analyzes the geographical and political mechanics of his first missionary journey, recorded in the book of Acts.
Right, so historians and careful readers of the book of Acts have always been puzzled by a specific, seemingly illogical detour Paul took. The text records that he sails from the island of Cyprus and lands at Perga on the southern malarial coast of Asia Minor. But instead of staying in the populated coastal towns to preach, or taking the relatively easy established Roman road east to his hometown of Tarsus, Paul and his companion Barnabas embark on this grueling, dangerous 100-mile trek directly north, straight over the rugged, bandit-infested Taurus Mountains.
Which is just a brutal climb.
Their destination was a small, isolated Roman military colony called Pisidian Antioch. Why on earth would Paul make that brutal, geographically illogical climb?
For decades, it was a mystery, often chalked up to Paul seeking a healthier climate. But the true answer, as revealed by modern archaeology and a deep understanding of Roman political networks, is far more strategic. The key to the mystery lies in what happened just before they left Cyprus.
What happened there?
When Paul was on the island, Acts chapter 13, verse 12, records that he had a profound encounter with the highest-ranking Roman official there, the proconsul Sergius Paulus. And the biblical text explicitly states that the Roman governor believed, for he was amazed at the teaching about the Lord.
So Paul has just facilitated the conversion of a massively influential, high-level Roman aristocrat.
Yes. And recent archaeological excavations in modern-day Turkey have unearthed a crucial piece of physical evidence. Archaeologists discovered a massive, honorific stone inscription in the ruins of Yalvaç, which is the exact site of ancient Pisidian Antioch. The inscription proves conclusively that the vast ancestral family estate of the Paulus clan Sergius Paulus's family was situated exactly in Pisidian Antioch.
Wow. So climbing the Taurus Mountains wasn't a random detour or a search for fresh air. It was a highly calculated strategic deployment.
Absolutely. The New Testament scholar Ben Witherington III, cited in the report, points out the mechanics of how the Roman patronage system worked. Paul, who possessed Roman citizenship himself, likely utilized this newfound high-level connection. It is highly probable that the converted governor, Sergius Paulus, directed Paul to his family's stronghold, perhaps even providing him with official letters of recommendation, financial backing, or introductions to the local elite.
It was a providential open door. Armed with his Roman citizenship and the political backing of the Paulus family, Paul bypassed the easy coastal road to establish a secure, strategic stronghold for the gospel in the heart of southern Galatia.
And the archaeological context of what Paul found when he arrived in that Roman colony makes the content of his preaching there even more profound and subversive. The report details the discovery of the Priene calendar inscription, which dates back to 9 BC. This was a ubiquitous piece of imperial propaganda.
What did it say?
The inscription officially hailed Caesar Augustus as a divine savior, whose physical birth was the literal good news or gospel for the entire world.
So the entire political and religious machinery of the Roman Empire was built on the claim that Caesar was the savior who brought peace. And Paul walks right into this fiercely loyal Roman military colony, utilizing Roman roads and Roman aristocratic connections, only to stand up in the synagogue and proclaim that a crucified Jewish carpenter named Jesus, not the emperor in Rome, is the true and only savior of the world.
It was a direct theological challenge to the imperial cult. The analysis points out that Paul brilliantly used the cultural and legal avenues available to him, his citizenship, his rhetorical training, his elite connections, to aggressively advance the kingdom of God. It is a masterful historical example of Christ's command to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves.
But the crucial theological takeaway is that while Paul used political connections, his ultimate reliance was never on that political favor. Because when the local leadership in Pisidian Antioch eventually turned against him and orchestrated his expulsion from the city, Paul didn't compromise the message to win back their patronage. He didn't water down the gospel to keep his powerful friends.
Because, exactly as we discussed with the Puritans in 1662, the fundamental calling remains unchanged across the centuries. Obey God rather than men, and boldly proclaim the unsearchable riches of Christ, regardless of the political cost, as Paul himself later wrote in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 8.
It's incredible how the physical stones of history, like the Yalvas inscription, continually cry out and confirm the precise details of the biblical record. But it isn't just the stones that bear witness. Our final source today looks at the literal, organic wood of the ancient biblical world. We are looking at a botanical and archaeological study of the cedar of Lebanon.
Cedars Lebanese. In the ancient Near East, this was the absolute gold standard of timber.
Yes, the Biblical Archaeology Society report details exactly why this specific wood was so legendary and economically vital. It grew exclusively in the high, rugged mountains of the Levant. Mechanically, it was a marvel. It possessed a highly pleasant natural aroma, the wood grain didn't shrink or warp much under stress, and it was naturally permeated with oils that made it incredibly resistant to rot, water damage, and wood-boring insects.
Very sturdy.
Plus, it grew massively tall, straight, and relatively knot-free.
Which made it the premium, indispensable building material for the monumental architecture of ancient kings, for the construction of massive palace roofs, and crucially, for the structural hulls of ocean-going ships.
The biblical text is absolutely saturated with references to the massive international trade networks required to acquire this wood. The historical books record that King Hiram of Tyre supplied massive quantities of cedar to build King David's palace, as noted in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 11.
Right, David used it.
Later, King Solomon orchestrated a massive labor force to cut the timber and float massive rafts of cedar logs down the Mediterranean coast to construct the first temple in Jerusalem, a massive logistical undertaking detailed in 1 Kings chapter 5 and 2 Chronicles chapter 2. Even centuries later, after the Babylonian exile had decimated the nation, Zerubbabel imported Lebanese cedar to rebuild the Second Temple, according to Ezra chapter 3, verse 7.
The cedar was synonymous with permanence, majesty, and the dwelling place of God. And modern underwater archaeology is physically proving the astounding durability of these ancient texts.
That is the most amazing part of the report. The archaeologists detailed the excavation of the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey. This was a late 14th century BC merchant vessel, an incredibly ancient ship. When they conducted microscopic botanical analysis on the surviving wood, they discovered that virtually the entire structural hull of the ship was constructed from planks of Lebanese cedar.
That's amazing.
It survived at the bottom of the ocean for over 3,000 years.
And this archaeological confirmation extends right into the New Testament era as well.
Right. The report highlights the famous Jesus boat discovered in 1986, buried in the mud on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. It's a verified first-century fishing vessel, exactly the type Peter and John would have used. When researchers tested the various types of wood used to make structural repairs on that boat, they found pieces of imported Lebanese cedar. Those local first-century fishermen knew exactly how durable and rot-resistant the wood was, and they likely recycled precious scraps of it across multiple generations to keep their boats afloat.
Wow.
The archaeologists even note finding ancient cedar beams during modern restoration projects at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem that carbon dated all the way back to the Old Testament period.
The physical-chemical endurance of this specific organic material is scientifically astounding.
And looking at that endurance brings a powerful analogy to mind as we tie all these sources together. When you look back through the long lens of history, the rooted deep in the rock, durable against the elements, and fundamentally unyielding.
Exactly. Just as King Solomon deliberately selected the rot-resistant cedar to construct a lasting physical earthly sanctuary, the theological framework applied to these sources asserts that God calls believers to build their lives on the unyielding eternal foundation of Jesus Christ.
That's the ultimate foundation.
The documents cite 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 to 13, which delivers a profound warning. We must be careful how we build, because the fire of judgment and the trials of time will test the quality of every man's work. We cannot build our lives with the disposable wood, hay, and stubble of secular philosophies. We must use spiritual materials that possess eternal permanence.
We have to cultivate a resilient, historically grounded faith. A faith rooted deeply in the objective truth of God's Word, as the Apostle Paul explicitly commands in Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 to 7.
Because we live in an age dominated by disposable culture, rapidly shifting social values, and increasingly hostile secular institutions, the theological conclusion of our deep dive is that relying entirely on the regenerating power of the Holy Spirit, rather than the power of the state, is the only mechanism that allows believers to remain steadfast, unmovable, and continually fruitful. They are called to serve as living, breathing, enduring testaments to the sovereignty of God, precisely as Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 to 22 describes the church, a people growing together into a holy, eternal temple in the Lord.
What a massive, sweeping journey we have been on today. We started by looking at the necessary but ultimately limited external fence of civil authority and the sword in the night markets of Quezon City. We witnessed the tragic, terrifying failure of the internal human heart in the unprecedented wave of school violence across the Philippines, and we examined the profound theological argument for why secular psychology fails to address the inherent root of human depravity.
And we critically examined the encroaching legal overreach of the secular state into the religious conscience of children in Palo Alto and Scotland, highlighting the vital biblical necessity of parental authority and adherence to the First Commandment.
We saw the brutal, physical cost of public witness, with a joyful street preacher in West Hollywood and a dying, unjustly imprisoned pastor in China. We celebrated the faithful, biblically structured transition of pastoral leadership at Grace Community Church. And finally, we looked at the astonishing historical courage of the Puritans in 1662, the providential, archaeologically confirmed footsteps of Paul in Galatia, and the miraculous, enduring strength of the Lebanese cedar.
It is a vivid, complex tapestry of sources. When viewed through the theological framework we have applied today, it demonstrates one cohesive reality. While the systems of the world are chaotic, hostile, and temporary, the truth of God remains absolutely sovereign, historically verifiable, and immovable.
And that reality leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day. We spend so much of our short lives agonizing over the temporary policies of passing governments. We stress ourselves into exhaustion over who is in political power, what new legislative laws are passed, or what cultural ideologies are currently trending on social media. But think about the archaeology we just discussed. If a piece of organic Lebanese cedar can sit buried in the mud at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee for 2,000 years, enduring the crush of the water and the rot of time, and still hold its structural shape, how much more permanent, secure, and invincible is the eternal soul that has been firmly anchored to the Creator of the universe? Look closely at the structures you are building your life upon today. Are they made of the passing, disposable trends of this current culture, or are they built with eternal timber? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep seeking the truth.